Most animal phyla have at least a passing resemblance to their neighbours on the evolutionary tree. So a worm's a worm, for example, even if it's got jaws or a spiky proboscis. Also, most phyla tend to have the majority of their classes, the major subdivisions, still alive. So let me introduce you to the echinoderms, because they like to do things differently. As you may have noticed on this channel, I rather like sponges. But a man can't live on sponges alone. There's just too much fascination out there to be quite that limited. That's why I do worms as well, for example. Ahem. Yes, Bob? You think I need to do something else as well? Okay. Any particular ideas? What's your favourite? Oh, yes. Okay, echinoderms it is then. But just an introduction today. I'm not going to go into their origins and their ancestry particularly, because that is an extremely debated area, quite contentious, and there's a lot more to do with it. But I can at least give you on tour of the basics, get you to understand this really incredible group of organisms, because they are actually quite amazing. It's strange how something as familiar as a starfish can be so utterly weird when you really get to look at them. I'm going to have to start with a few simplifications and then steadily undermine them just when you're getting comfortable. Right, hope you enjoy this one, because you jolly well should. Okay, so echinoderms are a phylum, equivalent to mollusks or arthropods, or indeed sponges. And a phylum shares a fundamental body plan, a structure and organisation that makes them distinct from all other phyla. So it's an artificial category, of course, but generally you know when you're looking at one group or another. There are exceptions. There are some phyla that kind of blend into each other, and indeed there are some phyla that get slotted into the middle of other ones, like the spiny-headed worms or acanthocephalans, which ended up being a type of rotifer, apparently. Genetics doesn't lie. Much. So phyla are divided into classes, the major subdivisions, which are again the most easily recognisable different groups, so that would be a class. There's not a huge number of them though, so there are 4 living classes of sponges and at least 1 extinct one. That's about typical. There are, well, in brachiopods the taxonomy seems to be a little bit in flux, but one modern version has about 8 classes, 5 of which were extinct. Mollusks have 7 or 8 classes, plus 2 or 3 extinct ones. You get the idea. So echinoderms, well, echinoderms have 5 living classes, but they went a bit silly in the early years. The name echinoderm is probably unfamiliar to most of you, but it includes some extremely familiar creatures. So the starfish, of course, and the sea urchins are another one. And the name actually translates as spiny-skinned, so you can see where that's coming from when you accidentally step on a sea urchin. But not all of the modern groups are particularly spiny. The main features of them that you can tell at a glance and make them very distinctive are things like the 5-fold symmetry, and they also have a hard skeleton made of plates of calcium carbonate. And the third thing is a thing called the water vascular system, which is something so unique it's kind of hard to believe. But you look at the underside of the arms and you've got these 5 rays going down it, and alongside those rays are lots and lots of tiny little holes, and sticking out from those pores in life are things called tube feet. They're basically little inflatable suckers. But the weird thing about them is that they are powered by seawater. So these suckers, the tube feet, the inside of them is topologically an external surface. They are extensions of soft tissue, but the inside is filled with seawater that is continuous with the outside. there is a single hole, a plate rather, which is a porous, called the madreporite, through which seawater goes in and out, and this circulates through the water vascular system, which is then controlled by little muscles and so on, which generate the ability to move these tube feet, inflate them, expand them, and as a result, they've got hundreds, thousands of things. They can use them to pick up food particles, pass them along one to the other down to the mouth, which is in the middle of that array of tube feet, or indeed to move the whole animal along, or to wrap its arms around a clam and pull the shells apart. They're really incredibly powerful things, and they're powered by external seawater. There's nothing else does anything like that. The skeleton is unique as well. It's made of thousands upon thousands of plates, which are each a single crystal of high magnesium calcite. They're also sort of structured in a unique way. So although they are a single crystal, each one is a microscopic honeycomb structure, which we call stereome. So they're very light and they're very distinctive. If you find a single plate of an echinoderm which is well preserved as a fossil, you know it's an echinoderm, because there's nothing else that makes their skeleton out of this sort of structure, this stereome. It might look like a shell when you see something like this, but it's also actually an internal skeleton. The whole thing is covered by a thin layer of soft tissue. And when you see a skeleton like this, which is all intact, that's actually quite unusual. Normally, this is not rigidly bound together at all. It's quite a delicate structure, and they're just sort of held together in place, rather than being bound together. So when the soft tissue decays, they fall apart. So you've got a unique skeleton, a unique water vascular system, and then they're pentaradial, for goodness sake. What's that about? There are lots of variations of these things, but you look at the basic structure and it has fivefold symmetry. There is no front, there is no back. There's a top and a bottom, the mouth is under there generally, but it's nothing like the structure of worms, for example, arthropods, where you have definite sort of front and back. That's not normal. It's especially not normal when the next closest phylum to them is the hemichordates. So these are the things that include acorn worms and graptolites, of course, your new favourites, which, apart from sponges, which are definitely bilaterally symmetric. They have a front, a back, a top, a bottom, as you would expect. And then their closest relatives are these things. It's really quite surreal. They shouldn't be like that. And outside them, the next closest relatives are thought to be the chordates, i.e. us. Quick caveat for Mulvaloo. There is some debate over whether this is actually true, or whether the chordates branched off first and then the echinoderms and hemichordates came off afterwards, but this seems to me to be probably not reliable and is dependent on exactly which model you use. Basically, we don't know the exact arrangement within what we call the deuterostomes, but probably the hemichordates and echinoderms are sister groups, and their next closest relative is us. So it's an odd place on the evolutionary tree to find something quite so bizarre. Today I'm not going to go into great detail about the early fossil record of potential proto-echinoderms, because a lot of these are highly debatable and we've got a long way to go before we can get to understanding those. But I do need to say a little bit about the basics of why these are such aberrant, bizarre-looking creatures. Because there's been a bit of work on this recently, particularly amongst the biologists, geneticists, and it turns out that there is a very good reason for it. In animals generally, different parts of the genome are expressed in different places, or they represent different parts of the body, if you like. And so we know which parts of the genetic code are tied to the head, which to the trunk, the body part, and so on. And so when you start looking in detail at the genetics of starfish, It turns out that the genetics that are expressed across the entire starfish appear to be the head. It hasn't got a body. What you do when you take something like a sea urchin is start with your head and then effectively think about any other particular organs that you're quite attached to and you don't want to get rid of, and then just sort of squeeze that lot up into the bottom of your head and then just discard the body. You've got everything you need in your head now. There's also been a lot of discussion or uncertainty over how starfish function, or echinoderms generally, because they don't actually have a brain. They have a nervous system. They have sort of ganglia and little concentrations of nerves in different places, but their brain is, well, it doesn't have a specific brain. It has bits of the nervous system distributed up the arms and in a ring around the centre and so on. And so the question was, why doesn't it have a brain? The answer is, it is a brain. The entire nervous system appears to be a distributed brain, which is kind of what you'd expect when you have reduced your entire body into a head. So, what do you call the nervous system inside your head? It's your brain. Kind of. You get the idea. This is a very odd situation in which the entire animal has been reduced into a noggin. And it's a little bit crazy, but that suddenly makes sense of the morphology to some extent, the fact that you have some form of radial symmetry, that you don't have really a front or back. It's all one sort of structure which has been condensed into. I say pentaradial symmetry, and technically it's actually not. They are in fact bilateral, but the only giveaway for that, when you're looking for a detail that is out of place, is a single plate, which I've mentioned before. Trying to find it can be tricky. Yeah, between two of the arms there is a porous plate called the madreporite, and that is where the water vascular system goes in. So that's where the seawater goes in, and that is not in the centre. And that one plate gives you bilateral symmetry, because it means that there is a single plane of symmetry which goes through the centre of the starfish and through the centre of the plate. So there is a sort of bilateral symmetry there. It's had this pentaradial symmetry superimposed on top of it. So when you reduce yourself to basically a brain in a jar, that gives you a lot of potential for exploring new avenues that haven't been done before. And so we get things as different as sea urchins and starfish. But let's have a look at the other groups as well, because there are, as I say, 5 classes of living echinoderms. And each of those two, the most familiar ones, the starfish and sea urchins, have a close relative as well. So the nearest living relative of sea urchins is in fact sea cucumbers. Yes, those squidgy things. They have basically, well, in very simplistic terms, if you take a sea urchin and have it fall over on its side and elongate into a sort of sausage shape, lose the skeleton effectively, turn it into just a mass of tiny little spicules embedded in the cuticle, and then pick up a few odd traits like, for example, spitting out your intestines when you're disturbed, then you end up with a sea cucumber. They're lovely things. And as odd as it might seem, they do dominate large chunks of the abyssal sea floor, so they're doing something right. Okay, on the other hand, the starfish relatives are a little more conventional. So, as well as the true starfish, or the asteroidea, there are also the brittle stars, which have a very similar sort of morphology, but instead of having the arms and the disc all in one, they have very clearly separated arms and a central disc, which is obviously different. So they are very closely related to starfish, but they go back to a common ancestor which was a little bit different to either of them. The brittle stars, or ophiuroids, are also a little bit more polite than their starfish cousins because their table manners don't tend to include extruding their stomach onto their food and just sort of digesting it outside their body and then slurping the whole lot back up again. No, the brittle stars just sort of stick their little arms up into the water and catch little pieces of organic material that are floating past. Quite civilised, really. There's one more living class of echinoderms, and they're actually more familiar to paleontologists than they are to the general public. These are crinoids. They are quite different to the others in that they are stalked, the stalk would have come off the bottom here, with a small body and then a mass of arms with which they filter food out of the water. They still have the ambulacra with the tube feet, by the way. They just run down the inside of each arm and feed down into the mouth at the top of the body there. These ones with the stalks go by the common name of sea lilies because they basically look quite plant-like, until you see one sort of crawling along the sea floor with little prehensile cirri. It's a bit weird actually when you see that for the first time, but they are definitely very much animal-like in the same way as a starfish is. However, in the modern, there are still stalked crinoids, these sea lilies, but they mostly live in the deep ocean. They have relatives in the shallow water called feather stars that have lost their stalks. They're actually free-swimming things. They sort of flap around in coral reefs especially, but you get them even around the coasts of the UK. And they can attach themselves temporarily by lots of little prehensile cirri coming off the bottom of the body, which would have come off the stalk, but the stalk's not there, so they can't do that. And they're lovely, graceful little things, but they're fairly unfamiliar to most people. They look like sort of multi-armed feathery starfish in a sense. It used to be thought for a while that there was actually a sixth class of living echinoderms, the sea daisies, or concentric cycloids. And these are beautiful little things. As far as I'm aware, there's still only a few species of them known. And they live in a slightly specialist habitat, on decaying wood in water more than 1 kilometre deep. Yeah, that's slightly limited. So, tree trunks at the bottom of the sea, the deep sea. And they are slightly aberrant in that they look a little bit like starfish, but they don't really have arms. And another thing they don't really have is a digestive system. They seem to have lost most of their digestive system. So it appears that they really absorb food directly from the water, kind of osmotically. But they are a very small and specialist group, and in the end they've turned out to be a weird group of starfish. They're just an aberrant group of starfish that evolved a very peculiar niche. So there we are, we're left with these 5 classes of modern echinoderms. But what about the fossils? Well, when you include them, you get up to somewhere around 30 classes, depending on exactly what you accept as a distinct class. There's no absolute consensus on how many there were, lists vary, but it seems to be between about 20 and 28 distinct extinct classes. Almost all of these extinct ones are Paleozoic, and mostly they diversified through the Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, and then declined again. So we're talking about things going back 300-400 million years and have been extinct for most of that time period. But in the early Paleozoic, they just went a bit bonkers. The big problem with the echinoderm fossil record, though, is the preservation. So there are 1 or 2 groups that preserve quite well. So you take a sea urchin like that, and this one actually has a fairly solidly fused skeleton. All those plates are tied together, bonded together quite tightly, so it doesn't fall apart. And you can get things like that from 70 million years ago, which are very, very similar, and it just happens to be in the chalk. So these can fossilise quite well. However, most things are not like that. The echinoderms have thousands of little plates which are tied together very loosely by soft tissues, and it can be very difficult to get conditions in which they haven't fallen apart. So what you normally see for crinoids, for example, is bits like this, where the entire skeleton has disintegrated after being washed around on the seafloor for maybe as little as a few days. maybe up to weeks or so, but it's collapsed into lots and lots of tiny little bits of the skeleton, mostly the stalk. If you turn this round, though, you get more or less complete crinoid, with this feathery arm mass. This is one from Morocco, which is famous for these beautifully preserved complete crinoids. Actually, it's that way up. The arms are getting branching upwards, and to preserve that, it needs to have been effectively buried alive, or very recently after death. It has to be buried, and then it has to stay undisturbed. No scavenging, no burrowing through it, no waves coming and reworking it and burying it again. As soon as that happens, it disintegrates. So to have a beautiful complete crinoid, or a brittle star, for example, it needs very abrupt burial, and then to remain buried forevermore until some paleontologist comes along with a hammer. In short, you need exceptional preservation. So you tend to get echinoderms in sites with exceptional preservation, at least marine deposits, because echinoderms are entirely marine, and always have been as far as we know. But you don't have to have them in something like a Burgess Shale type fauna. There are quite a lot of beds that we call starfish beds or Echinoderm lagerstätten, often in limestones, where we have the preservation of beautiful articulated echinoderms, and usually things like trilobites as well, if they're at the right age, but you don't get any sign of soft tissue. So it's a different tier of exceptional preservation. There has been decay, but it hasn't mattered because the skeleton was already entombed in the rock at that point. When you find these complete fossils, though, they are the most beautiful and fascinating of creatures, partly because they reveal such a extraordinary range of diversity of form that we see nothing resembling today. They're still obviously echinoderms in most cases, although even that gets difficult at times, but they have this plated skeleton. Sometimes they have the pentaradial symmetry, and they should have, in many cases at least, some trace of the ambulacra. Some of them are relatively familiar. So there are the somasteroids, which are a third class of starfish-like animals, which were earlier and probably at least partly ancestral to the ophiuroids and asteroids. Then you have others that are less familiar but fit into gaps in the tree of the classes we do have. So between the sea urchins and the sea cucumbers is a really bizarre group called the ophiocystioids, which are kind of Cthulhian type monsters with plated tentacles coming out from the corners of this flattened sea urchin like shell. Test. And these took a little bit of working out, but they actually have the same jaw mechanism, a thing called the Aristotle's lantern, that we see in sea urchins. So we know roughly where they fit in the tree. Others look familiar, but aren't. So here, for example, we have a lovely sort of tall-bodied thing with delicate arms coming out the top, which is called an eocrinoid, or dawn crinoid. The thing is, though, those aren't arms. An arm, in echinoderm terminology, is an extension of the ambulacra. You take the end of the ambulacra and you extend it and grow it outwards to form these arms. These structures, which are not branched, they're very simple, are coming off from the ambulacra. So you have the ambulacra, and then these structures come off from different points along it. They're called brachioles, and it's an entirely separate evolutionary origin of a filter-feeding arm array in echinoderms. That sets the pattern for a variety of these early groups, in that you have a multi-plated body, sometimes quite a lot bigger than you get in crinoids, with a little stalk at the bottom, which is not quite preserved in this one, and then at the top you have some tiny little ambulacra curling around on the upper surface, and then there may be brachioles coming up from the top as well. In this case, we've just got the bases of them. This is a thing that we call a cystoid, and in that case there are two groups of cystoids. This one looks like a rhombiphylum, which has sort of respiratory structures in the form of sort of a series of grooves and ridges between some of the plates on the theca. And there is another group called the diploporites, which just have little pores going through them in pairs. But there are quite a wide range of really substantially different groups, what we call classes, of the sort of globular-bodied thing, sometimes stalked, sometimes with brachioles. And one of the major groups that we can trace a lot of these other groups back to in the Paleozoic is called the Adveroasteroids. These are rather lovely. They're often disc-like, they're often encrusting, sometimes they're more globular, sometimes they're actually on a column, but they have these ambulacral structures on top of this little discoidal body, and they don't have brachioles. They must have had tube feet coming out of the ambulacra and actually catching things from the food from the water directly. But this is now getting really quite different to anything that's alive today. But you extend that upwards into a sort of more conical body, you stick a stalk on the bottom, add some brachioles, you've got an eocrinoid. Add some weird respiratory structures, you've got a cystoid. You can start to see how some of these might fit together. The problem is there's so much convergent evolution amongst all these groups that it's actually very difficult to put them together into a clear evolutionary tree. There's a lot of discussion over exactly which groups are most closely related to which. But there's a lot of them, and they are spectacularly crazy little things that you can spend quite a long time looking at. Some aspects of these things are actually still familiar, in that the mouth would be at the centre of the ambulacra, and you also would have had there's a little pyramid at one end which is the other end of the digestive system, so the anus is on a little cone. But one thing that's quite nice to see in some of these Adveroasteroids, and you can just about make it out here, is that pentaradial symmetry is not quite as it appears. Because here you can see that you've got one branch of the symmetry which is going off opposite the anal pyramid, and then the two pairs on either side actually don't quite join up with the base of that first one. There are very, very short structures between that base, where the mouth would be, where it goes off on sort of single lines, and then they split very rapidly. So you've actually got two rays, one ray, and two rays. So again, we've got bilateral symmetry. It just is pretending to be pentaradial. Some of the early groups don't bother pretending, though. I particularly like the triradial ones, helicoplacoids, where you basically have a sort of spindle-shaped body and three ambulacra that spiral all the way down. Just the three. But that's not as weird as they get, because some of them don't have any symmetry at all. That takes some doing for something with a definite organised structure to have no symmetry. But there are quite a few that manage it. And some of my favourite of all the echinoderms are the cornute stylothodons. We get them around here occasionally in the offshore mudstones, and they are sort of boot-shaped or U-shaped bodies with a single feeding arm. It took a long time to realise that it was a feeding arm and not a tail or some other structure, and so a lot of the reconstructions that you see are actually upside down. But yes, this is a feeding arm apparently. It has the cover plates which cover the ambulacral groove, and yeah, it's a bizarre thing. And we still don't fully understand the anatomy of it. There are interpretations of the various structures, things that look like gill slits, for example, but aren't really, probably. But they are a bizarre group, and there are other groups of stylothodons which are slightly less spectacular. There's also another group called solutons, which have a single feeding arm and a single other thing, appendage. In some of the very earliest ones in the Cambrian, these use one of the... hang on, which way up is it? I think it's got to be that way up. They use this lower one as a stalk, and it's actually attached to bits of trilobites, for example. But in other cases, it doesn't seem to have been attached, and presumably they use these to sort of dig into the sediment and pull themselves along with. Kind of like an oar for rowing, but it's difficult to imagine exactly how these would have moved, but probably with a sort of a looping motion, digging it in and then pulling it itself along. So they're a little bit weird. And you might think of that as being sort of potentially bilaterally symmetric, but that's not entirely obvious when you see something like this, because the body itself is asymmetric. It goes out further to one side than the other, and it appears to have been basically flattened. So there is not a clear bilateral symmetry. The plating is different on the top and bottom, whatever we define as top and bottom. They're a bit bizarre. Actually, they're quite a lot bizarre, but you're kind of used to that by now with these things. Okay, these are thought to be getting fairly close to the base of the Echinoderm family tree, but in that they appear in the Cambrian along with Stylophthans and various other groups. But there's been quite a lot of work recently, a fair few papers, which have been going into a few other groups and suggesting that this is actually starting to show us the ancestry of echinoderms, or the earliest morphologies. And for these groups, we need to go to the Cinctons and the Ctenocystids. They all have such lovely names, don't they? Ophiocystioids, Ctenocystidae. Yeah, it's all nice. But these do show a pretty clear bilateral symmetry. So they have plating on either side of the midline, which is moderately consistent, especially at this margin. Is that the front or the back? Is it top or bottom? Yeah, from this end. And there does seem to be a genuine bilateral symmetry in these things. They certainly have no pentaradial symmetry, and in many cases there's also no trace of ambulacra visible in the fossils. So it appears that that's two of the defining features of the modern echinoderms are not present at all. About the only thing they genuinely do have are these calcite plates with stereome microstructure. I had to think about that for a second, because I'm not totally sure that all of them are stereome, but I'm pretty certain that they are, actually, that there is some trace of the stereome even in some of these earliest fossils. Quite often it's lost because of recrystallization. That makes it difficult, but yeah, pretty certain they do have stereome going back, as far as we can tell, all the way to the beginning. And certainly this plated endoskeleton is a feature of the earliest things which we can pretty clearly assign to echinoderms. Okay, I have presented all this really quite loosely, just to give you a sort of general overview. But if only it were that simple. There are various other groups, like the cyclocystoids, which we're not entirely sure what to do with, to be honest. They're just wonderful things. They're very rare fossils, like many of these groups. I think the helicoplacoids are only known from 2 sites worldwide. Cyclocystoids I've never found. I know people who have, but they are not common at all. There are things like this. Yes, the whole of that is a great big lump of plated echinoderm. It's a thing called calyx, which I believe is meant to be some sort of cystoid in the old terms, maybe diploporide. They get big, and these you find in certain layers in Morocco and 1 or 2 other places, but it's just, you have to be in exactly the right place to find them. So although there's been a lot of work on the early evolution of the phylum in recent years, there's still a lot of these aberrant or peculiar Paleozoic groups that we're not totally sure where to fit into the evolutionary tree. We can still talk about general patterns though, and it's fair to say that most of echinoderm history has involved suspension feeding in one form or another. So you have even today things like the ophiuroids, the brittle stars, which can lift 1 or 2 arms up into the current and catch particles that way. The crinoids, of course, this wonderful suspension feeding arm array. But if you go back to the earliest ones, before they developed these really quite advanced adaptations, they seem to have been suspension feeding with the tube feet alone. There's not much else to catch food with, but they have the ambulacra. They possibly had quite long tube feet, spreading up into the water and catching anything that went through them. And this means that the more extreme types of feeding strategies that are involved in modern echinoderms are derived. I mean, starfish externally digesting corals or bivalves is pretty extreme, but then so is the development of these dolomite teeth in sea urchins, which they use to rasp away at algae or other animals. And I should probably say, Bob, that some starfish actually do eat sponges as well as other things. Yeah, probably sensible. Okay, so the echinoderms are a story of extraordinary diversification and experimentation. All these numerous classes that evolved very early on in their history. Most of them didn't survive the test of time in a sense of they only lasted 100 million years or so, but they were still successful enough to make it into the fossil record in the first place. And that actually takes some doing, especially when you're as delicate as these things were. So it's very easy to dismiss the sort of early experimental classes that didn't make it even out of the Paleozoic as failures, but in fact they were totally well adapted to the environment in which they lived at the time, to the ecosystems that they were part of. And during the Ordovician, when a lot of the groups got going, including all of the modern classes, all evolved during the Ordovician, and many of these ancient classes went extinct as well. They were all adaptations to filter feeding initially, or possibly detritus feeding, or possibly grazing in the case of some of the starfish and so on. They also show a very clear illustration of an evolutionary pattern that we see quite commonly through many groups of animals in the Paleozoic, which is that the new groups originated more in shallow water than in deep water. And we see this very clearly in the Bilthinlayer where we live, because we have here the range of water depths from very shallow water sandstones, where you get things like bits of crinoids, including their holdfasts, still embedded in the sediment, down to mudstones with stylophodons preserved quite abundantly. We get starfish in various places, and we can map out the ecological patterns of the different groups. And when we did this, we found that the dominant groups in the shallow water were crinoids, and then other derived groups like starfish, possibly even sea urchins, and occasionally bits like cystoids, which also were Ordovician origin, but they didn't last as long as some of the others. You go into the offshore mudstones and you get stylophodons, and you get solutans very rarely, and at one site you get things which we described as holothurians, the first, in fact the earliest sea cucumbers. But that has been disputed, but it's still up in the air. The preservation isn't quite clear enough to prove it, so it seems. But it's a totally different suite of organisms. And then between the two, just around storm wave base, where the water isn't turbulent enough to bring lots of food particles washing over your crinoids, and it's too turbulent for those little delicate deep sea creatures like the stylophodons, you end up with an extremely limited depauperate fauna of echinoderms, consisting of rare starfish and a few other oddities like one or two solutans. And Castle Bank falls into this category. And in 5 years of collecting, we found 6 starfish and 1 slab with 3 or 4 solutans. All of those species have only been found at Castle Bank. So we have a lot of diversity in terms of adaptation to different water depths. But within each zone, it seems, there's actually quite a high level of success and dispersal. So there are the dominant crinoids in the shallow water you get at multiple sites around the area. The stylophodons in the deep water you get at all the relevant sites where you can possibly preserve them. So it's a really interesting evolutionary pattern, and it seems to be that the ones that evolved in shallow water then displaced the ones that had a Cambrian origin, and they get pushed back into deeper water. And eventually those all went extinct, and we're just left with the most successful of the Ordovician group surviving today. It's hard to get across just how wonderful it is when you find a new specimen, even a new species of one of these groups, because they're just such gorgeous fossils. And there's so much left to understand about them, so much left to discover, because of these limitations on their preservation. You don't need a Lagerstätte to find them, but you do need a degree of exceptional preservation. They need to be buried rapidly, and then they need to be found. And often they're quite small. I know Castlebank is a bit extreme, but there the starfish are about 3 millimeters wide at most. But you need to keep your eyes open. But when you do, the rewards are amazing for these things. And in the Paleozoic, you can turn up almost anything. The odds are that there are more new classes out there to be found. So we will be going back to echinoderms in future. We'll explore specific groups of them and possibly their very earliest evolution as far as we can make out what was going on there. And if you enjoyed this, or you like the other things that we cover as well, please do subscribe and press that little like button. We have a members area as well, which has a little bit of extra content on unpublished research that we're working on, particularly from Castlebank. And yes, so thank you again for your support and for joining in, and hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you again soon. It's goodbye from us, and it's goodbye from him.